Number: single dad was about to sell a kidney for his child. The CEO grabbed the pen and said, "Marry me." In the steel-cold hospital room, George's hand trembled as he held the pen, staring at the organ donation contract before him. Behind the glass, his daughter lay dying, each heartbeat a countdown to collapse. As the doctor urged him to sign, a woman's hand suddenly seized the pen. Alexandra, the ice-cold CEO, looked straight into his eyes and said firmly but quietly, "Don't sign. Marry me instead." George Thompson had lived in that cramped rental apartment for 3 years now, the walls stained with mold, the ceiling leaking every time it rained. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that should have been condemned a decade ago. The heat barely worked in winter. The air conditioning was a pipe dream in summer. But none of that mattered. George would have lived in a cardboard box if it meant keeping a roof over his daughter's head. Everything in his life revolved around one person, his 7-year-old daughter, Emma. She looked so much like her mother. Same auburn hair, same green eyes that lit up when she smiled. Her mother, Sarah, had died in a car accident when Emma was 2. A drunk driver ran a red light. One moment, George had a wife and a future. The next moment, he was a widower and a single father, drowning in grief and hospital bills from a woman who never made it home. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago: progressive kidney failure. The words had hit George like a freight train. The doctor had said them so clinically, as if he were reading a grocery list. But George heard them like a death sentence. Emma needed a transplant. It was her only chance at survival. The costs started small: blood tests, specialist consultations, imaging scans. Then they exploded. Dialysis 3 times a week, 4 hours per session. Anti-rejection medications that cost more than his monthly rent. The ICU deposit alone was enough to make George's head spin. $25,000 just to reserve a bed. The hospital kept adding zeros to the bill, each one a nail in his coffin. By month 3, the total had climbed past $150,000. By month 5, it was over $200,000. George worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when he could find the hours. During the day, he drove delivery trucks, hauling boxes from warehouse to doorstep across the entire city. He'd start at 7 in the morning and finish at 6 in the evening, his back aching by noon, his feet screaming by sunset. He'd learned to ignore pain. Pain was a luxury he couldn't afford to acknowledge. At night, he washed dishes and did laundry at the very hospital where Emma lay connected to machines. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd scrub surgical instruments and mop floors in the same building where doctors told him they couldn't help his daughter without more money. He'd finish his shift at 2 in the morning, sleep on a cot in the waiting room for 3 hours, then wake at 6 to check on Emma before starting the delivery route again. On weekends, he picked up odd jobs, painting houses, moving furniture, anything that paid cash. He hadn't had a full night's sleep in 6 months. He'd lost 30 pounds. His friends stopped calling because he never had time to answer. His family, what little he had, lived 3 states away and had their own problems. He'd believed insurance would save them. He'd paid his premiums religiously for 7 years, even when it meant skipping meals, even when it meant walking to work to save gas money. But when he filed the claim for Emma's treatment, the rejection letter came back with cold efficiency. Pre-existing condition, congenital disease, not covered. The words were bureaucratic euphemisms for, "We don't care if your daughter dies. We got our money. You're on your own." George tried everything. He begged for payment plans. The hospital gave him one, but the interest made it impossible. He took out payday loans, the kind with interest rates that should be criminal. He pawned his car, then his wedding ring, the last piece of his late wife he still had. The loan sharks started calling. Then they started threatening. They knew where Emma went to school. They knew his schedule. They gave him 72 hours. Then came the final blow. The hospital's transplant coordinator pulled him aside one morning, her face professionally sympathetic. They'd found a match, a kidney, the right tissue type, the right antibodies. But they needed $20,000 within 24 hours to hold the surgical slot and keep the organ viable. Without it, the kidney would go to the next patient on the list, 24 hours. George didn't have $24 to his name. That's when someone slipped him a card. A nurse he'd never seen before, her smile too bright, her approach too casual. She told him about a program. Voluntary organ donation with financial assistance, a fund that helped people in desperate situations. George knew what it really was. He wasn't stupid. But when he looked at Emma sleeping in that hospital bed, her skin pale, her breathing shallow, he stopped caring about the details. That night, he sat by her bedside and watched her chest rise and fall. She stirred, opened her eyes, just a crack. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Daddy, don't leave me, okay?" George's throat tightened. He kissed her forehead and lied. "Never, sweetheart, I promise." The next morning, he called the number on the card. Alexandra Sinclair hadn't planned to be at Mercy General Hospital that Tuesday afternoon. She had a board meeting in an hour, a merger deal to finalize, and a PR crisis to manage. But when her assistant, Audrey, handed her the file marked urgent, everything else stopped mattering. Someone had tipped off the press. There were allegations of organ trafficking linked to one of the charitable foundations her hospital network partnered with. The foundation ran a program for voluntary organ donors, supposedly helping cover medical costs for altruistic individuals who wanted to help strangers. Alexandra knew better. She'd seen too many so-called charitable programs that were fronts for exploitation. She'd built her healthcare empire by being ruthless about one thing: never letting the system devour the people it was supposed to protect. She had a reason. A memory that never faded, no matter how many years passed, no matter how successful she became, no matter how many lives she saved. Her mother had died when Alexandra was 19. Cancer. Breast cancer. Stage 3. Caught late, but still treatable. The oncologist had said they had options: chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, a 90% survival rate if they started immediately. But their insurance had denied the claim. They cited some microscopic clause buried in page 47 of the policy documents. Something about the mammogram being classified as preventive rather than diagnostic. Something about a waiting period that hadn't been met. Something about experimental treatment protocols. The excuses changed every time they called. Alexandra had been a sophomore in college, working 2 part-time jobs and taking 18 credits. She dropped out immediately, came home, tried to fight the insurance company. She'd spent 3 months on the phone, filing appeals, writing letters, begging customer service representatives who read from scripts and didn't care if her mother lived or died. By the time they scraped together enough money, selling everything they owned, taking loans from predatory lenders, it was too late. The cancer had spread, metastasized to her mother's bones, her liver, her lungs. She died in a county hospital, in a hallway, because there were no beds available. Alexandra had held her hand and listened to her apologize. Apologize. Her mother had used her last breaths to say she was sorry for not having better insurance. Sorry for being a burden. Sorry for dying. Alexandra had sworn that day, kneeling on cold hospital linoleum with her mother's body still warm beside her, that she would never let the system win again. Not on her watch. She'd gone back to school, finished in 2 years, got her MBA, built a healthcare company from nothing. She'd clawed her way to the top, fueled by rage and grief. and she'd used every bit of power she gained to make sure that what happened to her mother didn't happen to anyone else. When she arrived at Mercy General, she went straight to the administrative wing. She wanted to see this voluntary donation program for herself. What she found made her blood run cold. The signing room was tucked away in a basement corridor, far from the main hospital traffic. Security guards stood at the door, but they weren't hospital employees. Their badges were wrong. The room itself was sterile, windowless. This wasn't a place for informed consent. This was a place for coercion. Alexandra pulled up the program's records on her tablet. The list of donors was long, too long, and the pattern was obvious. Single parents, immigrants, people drowning in medical debt, people who had no choice. She was about to call her lawyer when she heard voices down the hall. A man's voice, shaking. A woman's voice, smooth and practiced. Alexandra moved toward the sound. Through a partially open door, she saw him. George Thompson, 36 years old, according to the chart on the table. Dark circles under his eyes, hands calloused from manual labor. And that look. She recognized that look. It was the same one her mother had worn in those final days. The look of someone who'd already given up on saving themselves, who only cared about saving someone else. A broker sat across from George, sliding a contract toward him. The woman's smile was plastic, her words rushing. Alexandra scanned the contract from the doorway. The language was deliberately vague. Voluntary donation, no liability, compensation for recovery costs. It was a trap. Once George signed, they'd take his kidney, pay him a fraction of what they'd promised, and leave him disabled and broke. And if complications arose, if he died on the table, the contract's fine print absolved everyone of responsibility. Alexandra saw George pick up the pen. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. She didn't think. She moved. Alexandra strode into the room and snatched the pen from George's hand. The broker looked up, startled, then furious. She opened her mouth to protest, but Alexandra cut her off with a single look. "Get out," Alexandra said quietly. "Now." The broker hesitated, then grabbed her briefcase and fled. The security guards outside didn't try to stop Alexandra. They knew who she was. George stared at her, confused and desperate. "What are you doing?" "I need to sign that." "My daughter." "If you sign that," Alexandra interrupted, "you'll be dead or crippled within 6 months, and your daughter still won't get the care she needs. That program is a front. They harvest organs and sell them to the highest bidder. The donors, they get pennies and a lifetime of medical problems." George's face crumpled. "I don't have another choice. She needs a transplant. The hospital needs money. I don't have it. This is all I have left." He gestured at himself, his body, his last bargaining chip. Alexandra studied him. She'd seen 1,000 desperate people in her career. Most of them were looking for an easy way out, someone to blame, a handout. George wasn't like that. He wasn't asking for pity. He was trying to sell himself to save his child. She made a decision. "I have another option," Alexandra said. "Marry me." George blinked. For a moment, he looked like he'd misheard her. Then anger flashed across his face. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" "You think I'm going to—" "Listen to me," Alexandra said, her voice sharp. "I can pay for your daughter's transplant. I can move her to the top of the internal donor list. I can assign the best surgical team in the state. But if I just hand you money, the people running this trafficking ring will disappear. They'll destroy evidence, rebrand, and keep destroying lives. And, legally, a direct cash transfer will look like bribery or organ purchasing, which is illegal." She paused, letting that sink in. "But if we're married, I'm family. I have legal standing to make medical decisions, to authorize payments, to access records. I can protect you and your daughter while we take these people down. And when they come after us, and they will, you'll be my husband. That gives you legal protections, spousal privilege, witness immunity." George shook his head. "You expect me to believe you're doing this out of kindness? What do you really want?" "I want to burn this trafficking ring to the ground," Alexandra said bluntly. "And I need you alive to testify. That's the deal." She pulled a card from her pocket and wrote on the back. "These are my terms. We marry quietly. You and your daughter move into a secured location. You cooperate with my investigation. When it's over and your daughter is healthy, you're free to leave. File for divorce if you want. I won't stop you." George looked at the card, then at her. "And if I say no, then you walk out of here and sign that death warrant," Alexandra said. "Your choice." George's jaw clenched. He hated this. She could see it in his eyes. He hated being rescued. He hated the power imbalance. He hated that his daughter's life depended on a stranger's mercy. But he took the card. "Fine," he said. "But I have conditions too. You don't use my daughter for publicity. You don't parade us around like some charity case. And when this is over, we're done. No strings." Alexandra nodded. Agreed. They were married 18 hours later in a lawyer's office at 3 in the morning. No flowers, no guests, just a judge who owed Alexandra a favor, a marriage certificate, and 2 signatures. By dawn, Emma had been transferred to a private room in the hospital's VIP wing. A new surgical team took over her care. The transplant was scheduled for the following week. George should have felt relief. Instead, he felt like he'd traded one prison for another. Alexandra moved fast. She had to. Within hours of Emma's transfer, the trafficking ring noticed their missing asset. The broker, who'd tried to get George's signature, started making calls. Then, the calls turned into threats. Someone followed George to the parking garage. A man in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, eyes cold. George doubled back, took the stairs, lost him in the crowd. But the message was clear. They knew where he was. The media started sniffing around, too. Someone leaked photos of Alexandra leaving the hospital at odd hours. Gossip sites ran headlines. Ice Queen CEO's secret hospital visits. New boyfriend or health crisis. Alexandra ignored it. She dealt with worse. What she couldn't ignore was the internal pressure. Her own board started asking questions. Why was she personally involved in a transplant case? Why had she authorized such expensive care for a non-VIP patient? Was there a conflict of interest? Alexandra stonewalled them. But she knew the clock was ticking. The real attack came 3 days later. Emma's labs came back wrong. The attending physician, a man Alexandra didn't recognize, claimed there was a paperwork issue. The consent forms for the transplant weren't properly filed. They'd need to delay the surgery. Alexandra knew a stall tactic when she saw one. She fired the physician on the spot and brought in her own people. But the damage was done. The surgical window was closing. Then came the bombshell. A lawyer named Dante Morrison, representing the charitable foundation, filed a complaint with the state medical board. He claimed that George had signed a binding agreement to donate his kidney and that Alexandra had interfered with a legal contract. He presented documents, emails, bank transfers, even a video. The video showed Alexandra handing an envelope to George in a hospital corridor. It looked damning, like a payoff. The board launched an investigation. Alexandra was summoned to a closed-door meeting. They asked her point-blank, "Did you bribe a patient to sabotage a legal organ donation program?" Alexandra's lawyers advised her to settle quietly. Pay a fine, issue an apology, move on. She refused. George watched the news and felt his stomach drop. Alexandra was being crucified in the press. Organ trafficking scandal rocks healthcare empire. CEO accused of witness tampering, and it was all because of him. He knew what he had to do. He'd go back to Dante Morrison. He'd sign whatever they wanted. He'd say Alexandra forced him, coerced him, paid him off. Whatever it took to end this, he told Alexandra his plan. She looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "If you do that, they win," she said. "And Emma still might not get her transplant. They'll use you, discard you, and disappear." "Then what do you want me to do?" George shouted. "Watch you lose everything because you tried to help me?" "I can't," his voice broke. "I can't let another person I care about get destroyed because of me. My wife died in an accident I couldn't prevent. I've watched my daughter waste away because I don't have enough money. I'm not going to stand here and watch you burn for my sake. I won't do it." The words hung in the air. Another person I care about. He hadn't meant to say it, but there it was. Somewhere between the hospital hallways and the late-night conversations while Emma slept, somewhere between the fear and the fighting, he'd started to care about Alexandra Sinclair, not as a savior or a benefactor, but as a person who was sacrificing everything to do what she thought was right. Alexandra's expression softened. For the first time since they'd met, the Ice Queen facade cracked completely. She looked vulnerable, scared, human. "You want to know why I'm really doing this?" she asked quietly. "My mother died because the system failed her, because people with money and power decided her life wasn't worth saving. I watched her die in a hallway, George. I held her hand while she apologized for not being able to afford better insurance. She looked away. I built this company so I'd never be powerless again. But power doesn't mean anything if I only use it to protect myself. If I can't save you and Emma, then what's the point?" George stared at her. He thought she was cold, calculating. But she wasn't. She was just scared. Scared of failing the way she'd failed her mother. "Okay," he said. "Then let's do this right. What's the plan?" Alexandra's plan was audacious and dangerous and possibly insane, but it was the only way. She would arrange a meeting with Dante Morrison, pretending to negotiate a settlement. She'd agree to his demands, play the defeated CEO ready to surrender. She'd wear a wire. George would be nearby with Audrey, her assistant and closest confidant, recording everything from a safe distance. But Dante Morrison hadn't built an organ trafficking empire by being stupid. When Alexandra arrived at the meeting location, a parking garage beneath a shuttered medical office building on the outskirts of the city, she knew immediately that something was wrong. The garage was too quiet, too empty. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved like living things. She found 3 men waiting in the shadows. Dante Morrison stood in the center, flanked by 2 enforcers who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime movie. Big, mean, the kind of men who hurt people for money and didn't lose sleep over it. "Miss Sinclair," Dante said pleasantly, his voice echoing off concrete walls. "I'm so glad you came. Alone, I hope?" Alexandra's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face neutral. "I'm here to talk terms. You wanted a meeting. Here I am. Good. Very good." Dante smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "Then, let's be clear about something. You're going to issue a public statement tomorrow morning saying you made a terrible mistake. You'll admit you falsely accused our charitable foundation of wrongdoing. You'll resign from the board of your company. You'll liquidate your stake in Mercy General Hospital. And you'll never, ever speak about our program again. You'll disappear from public life quietly and gracefully. And if I refuse?" Alexandra's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. She clasped them behind her back so he wouldn't see. Dante's smile widened. "Then we release documents showing you've been covering up medical malpractice for years. Falsified records, bribed inspectors, illegal kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies. Your career will be over. You'll be lucky if you avoid prison." He took a step closer. "And Mr. Thompson, that touching little family you've built? We'll make sure he loses custody of his daughter. Unfit parent. Evidence of drug use. Whatever we need to fabricate. The girl will end up in foster care. Maybe she'll even need to wait years for another transplant match. These things happen." Alexandra's blood ran cold. They weren't just coming after her, they were threatening Emma, a 7-year-old child who'd done nothing except have the misfortune of being sick and poor. Before she could respond, one of the enforcers grabbed her phone. They searched her, found the wire, and ripped it off. "Did you really think we wouldn't check?" Dante laughed. In the car, 2 blocks away, George heard the audio cut out. He looked at Audrey in panic. "They found it," Audrey said. "We have to go in." "They'll kill her," George said. "Then we call the police. By the time they get here, it'll be too late." George made a decision. He got out of the car and ran. In the garage, Dante was still talking. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign a confession. You approached George Thompson and offered him money to falsely accuse our program of trafficking. You fabricated evidence." "You." The door burst open. George stumbled in, out of breath. "Let her go," he gasped. Dante turned, amused. "Mr. Thompson, how noble." "No," George said. "You're too late." He held up his phone. The video was already streaming. Everything Dante had said. The threats, the blackmail, the admission of falsifying evidence. And it was going directly to the FBI's cybercrime tip line, the State Attorney General's office, and 3 major news networks. Audrey had set it up before they'd even left the car. Dante's face went white. He lunged for George, but Alexandra was faster. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it hard. Dante went down. Sirens wailed in the distance. The arrests happened fast. Federal agents and state police swarmed the parking garage within minutes. Dante Morrison tried to run, but made it exactly 12 feet before he was tackled to the ground. The broker from the hospital was arrested at her home. 4 doctors on the trafficking ring's payroll were pulled out of their offices in handcuffs. A dozen enablers and accomplices, from hospital administrators to corrupt tissue bank managers, found themselves in custody before the day was over. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing millions in illegal organ sales spread across 5 states and 3 countries. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Falsified medical records. Victims who'd been coerced into donations and left with crippling health problems, some dead, some wishing they were. Consent forms with forged signatures. A whole system of exploitation built on the backs of desperate people who had no other options. The media descended like wolves. News vans surrounded the hospital. Reporters camped outside Alexandra's office building. The story was too big, too sensational to ignore. Healthcare CEO exposes organ trafficking ring. Undercover operation saves lives. Alexandra's name was cleared. The board issued a formal apology, though it was grudging and filled with legal language designed to avoid liability. The media pivoted from scandal to hero worship overnight. She was offered book deals, speaking engagements, magazine covers. But Alexandra didn't care about any of that. She cared about one thing. Emma's transplant happened 3 days after Dante's arrest. The surgery took 9 hours. George paced the waiting room floor, unable to sit, unable to breathe, unable to think about anything except his little girl on an operating table with surgeons cutting into her body. Alexandra sat beside him, silent, holding his hand when the pacing got too frantic. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him everything would be okay. She just sat there. Present, solid, real. When the surgeon finally emerged at 11:30 that night, still in scrubs, his mask pulled down, George's legs nearly gave out. The doctor was smiling. "The surgery went perfectly," he said. "The kidney function is excellent. Her body is accepting the transplant beautifully. She's going to be okay." George broke down, just completely collapsed into himself. All the fear and exhaustion and terror of the past 6 months crashing over him like a wave. Alexandra caught him, held him up, let him sob into her shoulder while the waiting room full of strangers politely looked away. "She's okay," George gasped. "She's okay. She's going to live. She's going to live." Alexandra echoed, and her own voice was thick with tears. "Daddy." Then she saw Alexandra standing beside him. Emma tilted her head, studying this woman she'd seen a few times but didn't really know. "Who's that?" Emma asked. George opened his mouth, unsure what to say. But Alexandra crouched down beside the bed. "I'm Alex," she said gently. Emma considered this. Then she said, "Are you the one who helped me get better?" "Your dad helped you," Alexandra said. "I just helped him." Emma smiled. Then she did something that made both adults freeze. She reached out and took Alexandra's hand. "Thank you," Emma said. Alexandra's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. 2 weeks later, Emma was discharged. George brought her home to the cramped apartment, but it didn't feel right anymore. Too many memories of fear and desperation. Alexandra offered them a place to stay, a guest house on her property. "Just until they figured things out," she said. George knew he should refuse. The deal was done. The trafficking ring was destroyed. Emma was healthy. According to their agreement, he was supposed to file for divorce and walk away, but he couldn't. One evening, after Emma was asleep, George found Alexandra in her study. She was staring at legal documents. "Divorce papers?" he asked. She looked up, startled. "I was going to ask what you wanted to do." George sat down across from her. "I've been thinking about that. About what I want. And I want to know if that marriage was just a contract to you," he said, "or if it became something else." Alexandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "When I first proposed, it was strategy, legal protection, a way to fight back. But somewhere along the way, she trailed off. You started to care," George finished. "Yes." She met his eyes. "I started to care. About Emma. About you. About having a family that wasn't just me and my work." George reached across the desk and took her hand. "Then, let's make it real. No contract, no conditions, just us. If you want that." Alexandra's breath caught. "Are you proposing to me?" "I guess I am." George smiled. "I don't have a ring. I don't have anything to offer except a 7-year-old who likes to paint at 3 in the morning and a dad who's terrible at cooking. But if you want us, we're yours." Alexandra stood up and walked around the desk. She pulled George to his feet and kissed him. When they broke apart, she was crying again. "I want that," she whispered. "I want all of it." 6 months later, they stood together at a press conference, not to announce a merger or a scandal, but to launch something new. The Emma Thompson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to transparent, legal organ donation support, free medical care for children in need. No strings, no exploitation, just help. George stood beside Alexandra, holding Emma's hand. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. One reporter asked, "Miss Sinclair, is it true that you and Mr. Thompson married as part of a legal strategy?" Alexandra glanced at George. He nodded. "Yes," Alexandra said. "We married to protect each other, to fight a corrupt system. But we stayed married because we fell in love. Sometimes the best things in life start as strategies and end as miracles." Emma tugged on Alexandra's sleeve. "Can I say something?" Alexandra crouched down. "Of course, sweetheart." Emma took the microphone. Her voice was small but clear. "My dad was going to give me his kidney," she said. "But Alex gave us something better. She gave us a family." The room erupted in applause. George pulled both of them close. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing hope of a drowning man, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who'd found solid ground. Alexandra rested her head on his shoulder and watched Emma wave at the cameras. She'd spent her whole life trying to save people from a broken system. But in the end, the person who'd saved her was a single dad who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for love. And that, she thought, was worth more than any empire she could build. The story could have ended there. But life isn't a story. It's messier, more complicated. 3 years later, Emma turned 10. She was healthy, thriving, painting murals on the walls of her room that Alexandra pretended to scold her for but secretly loved. George had gone back to school, studying healthcare administration. He wanted to help other families navigate the system that had almost destroyed his. Alexandra still ran her company, but she'd changed the way she led. She thought about people like George now, people who fell through the cracks. She built policies to catch them, and on quiet Sunday mornings, when Emma was still asleep and the house was peaceful, George and Alexandra would sit on the porch with coffee and watch the sunrise. "Do you ever regret it?" George asked one morning. "Grabbing that pen? Marrying a stranger?" Alexandra turned to him and smiled. "Every day." George's heart sank. "I regret," Alexandra continued, "that I didn't do it sooner, that I wasted so many years being afraid to care about people." George laughed and kissed her. "You're terrible at romantic moments." "I know," she said. "But I'm good at keeping promises, and I promised to marry you. Twice. Best decision I ever made," George said. "Second best," Alexandra corrected. "The best decision was not signing that contract." George shook his head. "No, the best decision was trusting you when you grabbed the pen." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher. Inside, Emma stirred and called for breakfast. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Built not on desperation or strategy, but on the simple, radical act of choosing each other when the world gave them every reason not to. And in the end, that was the real miracle.